Hello, everyone. Welcome to Navigating the New 2025 California Wildland-Urban Interface Code. My name is Paul Armstrong, and I will be your presenter today. I am the Western Regional Manager for the American Wood Council, and I'm actually living in California itself right now. Our course itself is going to be an introduction to this new code. The code itself will actually reside as a separate standalone code in Title 24 in Part 7. It's designed, obviously, to improve clarity and consistency by combining the provisions from three different codes that we'll talk about here in just a little bit into one code. The format is going to make it so much easier to find the criteria rather than having three separate codes open either on your monitor or if you use hard copies on your desk at one time. You'll learn a little bit about the structure, certainly we'll go through that, the purpose, and also key provisions in the code. We're not going to go into a lot of detail in the code criteria itself today. This criteria actually is what we're dealing with right now in those three codes. So there's really no technical change that will be addressed in this document at this time. We will talk about certainly the goals of this particular document. And at the end of all things here today, we'll talk about some future issues, we'll put it, and things that are going to be coming down the pipe that we're going to have to address in some manner. So it's a very interesting document. I think it's a document that has been a long time in coming. We'll get into the development of that document here in just a little bit. Our objectives here today are shown on the slide, of course. We're going to identify the key features and the structure of this new code. We have to understand where the code criteria is landing. We're going to examine where the existing provisions are found within that document itself. You can see the three codes that are listed here: the California Building Code in Chapter 7A, the California Residential Code in Section R337, which really is a transcription of what we have in Chapter 7A, and then the California Fire Code Chapter 49. Those are all bound within this one document. Those codes themselves are going to have a reference to the new Part 7 as opposed to retranscribing the criteria again in the three documents. We'll analyze certainly the format that was chosen for the document. That was a very interesting process. The process used the CWUI Code format because, frankly, it's one that's out there. It's a single document, and it was set up very, very well. And so we took that particular format and we developed it, if you will, using the three sets of code criteria that we listed before. We're also going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the issues with potentially with enforcement that's going to have to be addressed between the fire department and the building department. We'll talk about some of the design issues. There really isn't that much because, frankly, we're already dealing with this criteria itself. I believe, again, that this code is going to be something that is going to be much easier to use, and we will find the criteria much more readily than we do in having three separate codes. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about the purpose of the code. I know, it's pretty obvious, but we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about where the provisions are within this new Part 7 of Title 24. And then, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we're going to talk about some future direction or issues that are going on right now that may come in front of us very, very quickly. So let's get into the purpose of the code itself. Obviously, we want to mitigate the risks to the built environment, to occupants, to people that respond, firefighters and the like, to these wildland fires. And we want to make sure that we are not building in something that actually enhances the challenges with dealing with wildland fire. The guidelines themselves incorporate all the latest fire prevention and safety measures. Our state here in California has done an excellent job through the State Fire Marshal's Office of making sure we have the latest and greatest in front of us at all times. They have a standing Wildland-Urban Interface task group that meets on a regular basis and provides us with the opportunity and the input to basically build in the best that we can into the built environment and hopefully the survivability of our structures and buildings that are in these identified fire severity zones. So the development of the code happened to have been involved. American Wood Council had a number of staff members that were involved in this. It was a multi-year process. The California State Fire Marshal's Office, through their WUI task force, as I mentioned earlier, set up a lot of subgroups to try to compare and contrast, certainly, the criteria when it goes into a single document. The direction that we were given was to basically take the existing code text that we have currently in Chapter 7A of the Building Code, the Residential Code in Section R337, and Chapter 49 of the Fire Code, as you can see listed there, to take that and to place it into the ICC WUI Code format. It was surprising how long it did take to address that. There were attempts to bring in new criteria, but the State Fire Marshal's Office and State Fire Marshal himself made it very clear that for this first code that we were just going to carry over the existing criteria. We'll talk about changes potentially coming down the road towards the end of this presentation itself. Then in February 26th of this year, this code went before the California Building Standards Commission and was ultimately approved for publishing by ICC at that time. Now, the code itself is available from the Building Standards Code's website under the 2025 codes, triennial codes. So if you want to look at the code itself, it is available now. I've gone through it a number of times already. It looks very, very nice, and frankly, I believe it's much easier to use. Moving on to the provisions. We're going to actually go through the code. Now, being the good engineer that I am, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to go through the end. We're not going to talk about every provision, however. We're going to talk about some of the administrative issues, as I mentioned. We'll bring up some of the code sections. Again, if you're familiar with the criteria that we have in front of us in Building Code 7A or Chapter 49 of the Fire Code, these will look very familiar to you. So here we are. The scope. We understand that we are looking at the construction of buildings and other structures in these identified fire severity zones, WUI areas, if you will. Okay. The idea, and you can see in the third line, beginning of the third line, is that this criteria primarily applies to new buildings. It does not necessarily have a retroactive type of an enforcement built into it, because it'd be very difficult to get people then to upgrade their buildings, their facilities. It's very costly to do that. However, we'll talk about some of the additions and alteration types of situations in just a little bit. Okay. Obviously, we've already talked about the minimum requirements in this particular code and mitigating the hazards from wildland fires. This particular document, if you're not familiar with this, in particular from Chapter 49 of the Fire Code, also addresses the areas that surround these buildings and other structures themselves. And so we'll get to talk a little bit about vegetation. We'll talk about some of the space concerns out and about and the protection that those spaces provide. Okay. Obviously, we're trying to provide our suppression responders and all that with safety too. Okay, and to keep large property losses down to a minimum. So that's actually built into the code under the scope itself. It's a very lengthy scope, but I think it's one that is very clear in its approach and application ultimately. Okay, speaking of application, this makes certainly the application to new buildings very, very clear. All new buildings, I added the all term, but new buildings located in any fire hazard severity zone or identified WUI area must comply. Okay, we're talking new from the ground up. Obviously, as with any code, there's exceptions, and we have those listed here. There's 5. So the first one are just regular accessory buildings, sheds. You could look at them. Some play structures are actually very complicated and all that. Those fit into this as well in terms of the very large tree houses and things like that that can be built on properties. We're very concerned about the application of this to agricultural types of structures and buildings. And so we have an exception for that. And what you can see in both of those is that they have to be at least 50 feet from the applicable building on the same lot. Okay, very, very interesting to look at that. And then to understand that if you're within 50 feet, guess what? It applies. Okay, we have concerns, and that's part of the term that we're going to use is defensible space issues built in. Now, here in California, we have our own, if you will, occupancy classification for organized camps, like summer camps, things like that. Obviously, many, many, many occur in these fire severity zones. They've been identified as being in WUI areas. Kids, parents, and all that like to go up to the mountains. There's no doubt about it. Those are exempt so long as they comply with the criteria that we have for these organized camps themselves. Then, new and other accessory buildings that are described a little bit further on in the code in section 504.11 are also exempt. In other words, they're provided with some protection that should be sufficient enough to reduce the hazard there too. Now, exception number 5, additions to and remodels of buildings originally constructed prior to July 1st of 2008. Very interesting exception. Okay, one of the things we're going to talk about today is the new mapping that has gone on here in California and the changes that have occurred as a result. So we'll get into that. This has been kind of a challenge, certainly, for the enforcement community and for the design community too. Sometimes it's very difficult to figure out when a building has been constructed originally. Permit history is a very interesting thing. Fortunately, this is not that long ago. So a lot of this should be found in electronic files or archival systems that are available through the local cities, counties, state, whoever, that kind of a thing. So we have this exception that basically speaks to these older buildings. Now, with that being said, we do understand that there are a lot of existing buildings that were built prior to July 1st of 2008. And so we'll talk about some of that when we get to the future direction and some of the potential, if you will, at least the discussion that is occurring related to these particular buildings. Okay, speaking of additions and alterations, you can see that they can be made. All right, one of the big concerns with this criteria is that if you have a small addition or a small alteration, then would you have to upgrade the entire existing building? The answer is called out in this particular section. No. There are some provisions in this code that do apply to existing types of conditions. We'll talk about some of them, but we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper, I think, in a future presentation as to where those are. The main thing that we have is found in that last line in our slide. Unsafe conditions cannot be created by either the addition or the alteration. We don't want any of that to occur also. So we're going to be looking at that as well from an enforcement standpoint too. This is a very, very interesting section. It really comes from the fire code, I believe. Building structures, landscape materials, vegetation, defensible space, or other devices or safeguards required by this code shall be maintained. Wow. Okay. So, in other words, the owner, as we see in the next sentence, or the owner's authorized agent, has to know what was required under the previous code, okay, or the original code that was used for the design of this particular building. Maintenance is something that is unfamiliar to a lot of building department staff. We do have code officials, code enforcement officials, who do get into some of those concerns in those areas, but they don't know about this particular code yet. And so we're going to have to make sure that certainly the owners and their people in the insurance interests are very familiar with this and can move ahead. Insurance has become a very big concern, obviously, here in the state of California and frankly across the United States when you have these buildings in these particular WUI areas and the like. And so I am sure that a lot of the insurance interests are going to be taking a little bit of a closer look at how buildings are being maintained. I myself received a letter from our insurance provider indicating that our roof needed to be re-roofed. We needed to have new roof covering and all that. Otherwise, they were going to frankly cancel us. So guess what? We just finished a re-roof project ourselves as a result. They will be taking a much closer look at everything related to fire protection, whether you're in a fire severity zone or not. I currently do not live in a fire severity zone. They still did that. Interesting. Now, when you go through the adoption of this particular code, and certainly all of the California codes, obviously a big part of that adoption is the administrative provisions that we're talking about here and the requirement for permits. Now, in the building code, we don't have as much of a specific list like this for various types of uses or activities. Ours are more related to the structure itself, maybe the size of the structure. There's some activities there, but as you can see from this particular list, there are a lot of uses that are basically required to get approval for in wildland-urban interface areas, okay? There are some very interesting ones, some that are unbelievably obvious, and we've had for a long time, open burning, fireworks, but flammable or combustible liquids, hazardous materials, LPG, liquefied petroleum gases, that's interesting. A lot of the structures, cabins, if you will, in more rural types of buildings use LPG as their energy source. So they would have to get a permit for that. They do that anyway, okay? And then there's temporary uses, temporary structures such as tents, canopies, and the like that you would find potentially for different events like weddings, other types of parties out there. They are going to be requiring permits based on the size, and they'll come up with their own criteria and the like. Now we're getting into some of the required material, if you will, required documents that need to go along with the plans themselves for the new construction. We're very used to site plans. We've seen a lot of those over the years. However, what I was surprised at is the level of detail in this particular criteria. It includes the topography, the width and The width and percent of grade for access roads, we don't normally see a lot outside of the subject property, but we're going to have to see that if you have separate access roads. Landscape and vegetation details. We'll get into some of that here in just a moment. Locations of other structures, existing or proposed overhead utilities, and some basic things, occupancy classifications of buildings, we get that anyway. The type of material, ignition resistant, or what is allowed by the code for the buildings themselves, the structures, their appendages. Roof classification, we pretty much see Class A no matter where we go here in California now. And certainly any site water supply systems. Now, the code here at the end of this particular section gives the code official the authorization to look at this list and determine whether or not something is really required. Okay, you are not forced to provide everything, because you don't always need to provide everything for every given project. And so we get that, and they built that into this particular section. Speaking of vegetation, this is one that while we see this in other areas because of water concerns, water conservation concerns, really, that kind of a thing, we're looking at this from a fire, if you will, resistance kind of lens. Okay, prior to the building permit final approval, not permit issuance, the final signature, if you will, approving the project, the property itself has to be shown to be in compliance with the vegetation management requirements that we have here in California. Okay, you can use, there's four ways, if you will, of determining all that that's listed there, but we are going to be looking at the actual landscape materials at some point to determine if they comply or are in compliance with certainly the code. Very, very interesting, especially for those of us in the building code side. We're not used to looking at what is surrounding the building. Well, we're going to have to be from now on. And in fact, one of the future items is going to get into that in a big way. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. A fire protection plan. Now, the code official needs to determine whether or not it's required, but effectively, that plan needs to be in place, again, when the code official feels that it's required by Section 602. And it has to be submitted for review and approval prior to permitting. Okay, so we have the vegetation management compliance package that is at the final signature, but this fire protection plan has to be done with the construction documents, basically, and approved at that time by whoever is doing the plan review, and then ultimately the approval of that particular permit. So it's very interesting situation. We don't have that with any other areas. We have requirements in the code, obviously, that talk about active and passive types of fire protection assemblies or systems, things of that nature. We get that, but that's all built into the actual construction plans themselves. This is a separate plan that would be required to go along with those construction documents. Again, very interesting. Okay, that was it for chapter 1. Again, like I said, I start from the beginning and go to the end. I really like definitions. This is the language we speak. This is how we communicate much more effectively, I think, if we understand the terms that are being used. Now, I just grabbed a few here, some of them just because I wanted to include that. Critical fire weather, we hear that here in California. Usually that involves a term called Santa Ana winds, but it doesn't have to be Santa Ana winds to be a problem in these WUI areas. Very low humidity, some wind is a problem, obviously, and certainly the Santa Ana conditions, and when they get up to be big conditions, if you will, like we had earlier this year, unfortunately, then we all know that there could be problems. My reason for bringing in the next two definitions is mostly the parenthetical statement there. We know what a dead end road is, okay? But effectively, this shows that we actually grabbed some of this criteria from Title 14, not Title 24, and included that as well. And so all of this is going to serve to make it so much easier to find this criteria as we move forward. Well, here we go. Vegetation. Fire smart vegetation, that's the term. Okay, plants, shrubs, trees, anything and everything that can be grown, if you will, in the landscaping around these buildings needs to be evaluated and determined if it complies or not. Now, the definition itself is very interesting. I am not a landscape architect. I have reviewed plans, if you will, landscaping plans for other reasons. I haven't done that in terms of looking for fire smart vegetation. So it's a very broad, very vague to me type of a definition. However, we have a note that's been provided. And I really like this note. I'm not usually a big fan of commentary, which this note is, but this gives us direction as to where we can find, you know, this vegetation that's fire smart, right? We have a list of documents here that can be used. And the funny one to me, just because it goes way, way back, is the Sunset Western Garden book. I think so many people have had that particular book just in the regular working with their own landscaping around their properties over the years. It's been around for a long time. It's just very interesting to see that listed here as being a source for finding what is fire smart out there. Now, a lot of us that have been in the business understand these two terms, the local responsibility area and the state responsibility area. There is a very interesting aspect to this because while a lot of us used to say, well, it's within a charge, you know, a city or a county and all that, but in reality, what it is, it's areas of the state in which the financial responsibility of preventing and suppressing fires is the primary responsibility for the city, county, so on and so forth. It could be a fire district too, for that matter. And then the state, primary financial responsibility is the states. So that's what defines, if you will, these areas for us. Very, very interesting to have that in a code because we don't get into a lot of the financial responsibility kinds of concerns in any other project from a code type of requirement. So just fascinating to see that. You learn something new every day. I did. I have assumed I had a much simpler, if you will, view of these two terms. And now it's a little more clear to me as to the application. Okay, that was chapter 2. Moving on to chapter 3. We have 7 chapters, by the way, and there's appendices as well. We'll talk about them. Each of these next slides are individual types of chapters for the most part, but we're going to talk about, you know, the goal, the intent of the criteria itself. You can see certainly for chapter 3, the scope is called out pretty clearly that this is the methodology that is used to establish these fire severity zones, the WUI areas and all that. In reality, what it is, it's how we map. Okay, and and again, going back to that, it's how the state maps out these particular zones. And the purpose, obviously, is to classify all lands in the state as to whether or not they have achieved a level of fire hazard that gives them or puts them into one of these fire severity zones or identified WUI area. Obviously, the purpose also includes to reduce the potential intensity of uncontrolled fires, so on and so forth. We get that. We understand that. And frankly, we live and breathe that pretty much every day. Chapter 4, as I said, the next few slides, it's 1 slide per chapter. Okay. Chapter 4 provides the requirements within the area that is identified as a WUI area or a fire severity zone that need to be provided so that we can have responders, firefighters, presumably, get to the property, get to the area of incidents, and then obviously conduct suppression cleanup activities. So the first one is the fire service access road to the property. Okay, very interesting, because it doesn't mean that it has to be actually on the property itself. It could just be some dirt road or whatever that's out there. We need to make sure, though, that that particular, for lack of a better term, pathway is available for fire apparatus or other types of equipment to go up there and conduct their operations. Another big one, a really big one, it's surprising, is premises identification, proper address. We want to make sure, certainly, that when addresses are identified as having a problem, wildland fire presumably, that those people, firefighters that are sent up there, can find that particular property. Make the right turn, get to the right driveway, things along those lines. Okay. Item number 3 then is applied, and we need to make sure we have key boxes, some call them Knox boxes and all that, when there are gates across these gated types of driveways, roadways, other paths that can be used by our fire suppression personnel. And then certainly item number 4 is very, very clear, and we've had some challenges here lately with some of the recent fires, that any type of water that's provided for fire protection, okay, is identified and provided in that area. Okay. There's been a lot of discussion about that related to some of the wildland fires down here in Southern California. We get that. Okay. The last one is that any equipment that is built in up there, fire hydrants, things along those lines, are clear. They're protected, if you will. Even during winter months, believe it or not, we want to make sure that you clear snow away from any kind of fire hydrant and all that, just in case there's a problem with a building in close proximity. So we make sure that certainly the ability to conduct their operations is provided. Now here we are in the actual construction criteria. Okay, this is what people like myself are used to. You can see in that second paragraph there that it's intended to supplement what we have already in the California Building Code and the California Residential Code. We get into all kinds of things. There's been a lot of people, obviously, that have been doing design and building in these particular fire severity zones, WUI areas and all that, and they're used to that. We have requirement for ignition-resistant construction materials. We talk about the protection of underfloor areas, because if you get a fire that makes its way inside the building, under the floor, in the crawl space perhaps, that kind of a thing, very difficult to handle. And so we have criteria for that. Obviously, roof coverings, any sort of opening into concealed spaces, eaves, soffits, things like that are protected with vent covers. Even gutters and downspouts, we require that they be non-combustible. So that's something that doesn't typically require a permit. Very, very interesting to see that there. I don't know how we're going to enforce that, except perhaps during the inspection of these particular buildings. But it's interesting to see that, because sometimes the different activities, since they don't require a permit, go on without anybody's oversight. The construction of exterior walls, doors and windows, again, ventilation openings, accessory structures, things of that nature are all built into this particular chapter. And if you remember, the accessory structure exception in the beginning, the last accessory structure exception talked about complying with section 504.11. Obviously, this is chapter 5. So that's here in this particular set of criteria. It's again consistent with what we have right now. We'll talk about some future issues and some different, different things going on that the state fire marshal is working on right now through their task force and the like as we move through the end of this particular presentation. Chapter 6, we're almost there, I promise. Okay. We have the process for adopting, the various zones, getting into that here within jurisdictions. The development of fire protection plans, the development of landscaping, vegetation management plans, things along those lines. And then here we go, the creation and maintenance of defensible space. There's that M word again, maintenance, to protect, obviously, the various structures, buildings, things on the property itself, so that, we don't have as much risk from embers piling up and catching various combustible, if you will, vegetation and other products adjacent to buildings and causing a problem. So a lot of that is built into this particular chapter itself. Then chapter 7, and then appendices. Chapter 7 is just a list of all the reference standards. Like so many codes these days, you have to have the other standards to go alongside so you understand the actual application of everything that the code is intending to cover. We have various appendices that may or may not be used by local jurisdictions when they adopt this particular code itself. Obviously, there's general requirements. Appendix B is the development of vegetation management plan. There's some very interesting criteria that we don't have, or appendix materials that we don't have in any other code, like found in Appendix D. That's actually a model adopting ordinance for the fire hazard severity zones. And then with that, the findings of fact, Appendix F talks about, obviously, vegetation again. Appendix G is one I like, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the future items, but voluntary home hardening recommendations. And then, we have an Appendix H for other types of documents that California has. So in order to have these, if you will, legally, when you go through your adoption at your city or your county or what have you, make sure you list out those particular appendices that you want to include, or just make sure you don't list ones you don't want to include, that kind of a thing. Okay, that was the code. Now we're going to talk about future direction and some future issues from here on out. We have certainly some basic things. This is a living, breathing code that will be maintained in the code development process that the state fire marshal has. It's not an ICC code per se, so it's not subject to the ICC code development process. But the WUI task force meets on a regular basis. They will continually evaluate, assess any sort of new risks, any sort of new products, that kind of a thing itself. We've already talked a little bit about emerging wildfire risks, and we understand certainly that with some of the wind conditions that we have down here in Southern California, and frankly in other parts of the states, we have a major risk of having conflagrations like we experience in Eaton Canyon and Pacific Palisades area. That is a real problem. Okay. One of the things that we talked about, and I gave you a heads up on that, is defensible space. There is a bill right now going through our legislative process, and there's a regulatory type of a process through the WUI task force that talks about the implementation of what is called Zone 0. It's a 5-foot zone from the exterior, the identified boundary of the project itself, the building itself. And it's intended to have everything there be non-combustible. With that being said, that means fencing too. If the fencing should be inside that 5-foot zone, within 5 feet of the building itself or structure, then it's going to have to be non-combustible. Very interesting to look at that. Again, a lot of our building inspectors are not familiar with all of this yet, there will be extensive training, no doubt, provided to get through the educational, if you will, learning curve that's going to be required for this. Now, another thing that they're talking about is, and it's only in the discussion phases right now that I know of, is potentially expanding the application of this criteria in the local responsibility areas to both the high and the very high fire severity zone. Currently, LRAs, if you will, are only required to enforce the code in the very high fire severity zone. But we know, certainly based on our recent experience, that even the high fire severity zones have the same kind of criteria, the same issues and hazards. Well, it makes it kind of interesting in terms of getting into some of these geographic areas that had not seen the application of this code before. Now, we talked about new mapping going on, and this is related to this. The State Fire Marshal's Office authorized new wildland-urban interface mapping techniques to go on, and they created new maps for us here in California. So we have the 3 zones. We have certainly identified, within the regions, those areas where those maps will be applied. As you can probably guess, there has been an expansion of the geographic area covered in all 3 zones. There was something that was very, very surprising to me, however, because in some areas the development has been to a certain degree that they've actually reduced the area covered by a given fire severity zone in a given county. Now, the State Fire Marshal has on their website information, data, if you will, about the expansion or the contraction of these areas. It'd be very good to take a look at that, take a look at the maps, understand the application, within the areas that you live, work, and play in. And then, obviously, then we're going to have to be enforcing that come the beginning of January. Now, there's another bill that was signed into law, actually a couple of years ago, AB 2322, a very, very interesting bill that covers wildland fire, if you will, hazard types of remediation, for lack of a better term. Okay, so for non-residential critical infrastructure, if you are located with that particular use in a very high or moderate fire severity zone, then if you're in the very high fire severity zone, you actually protect that use, that building, to 4-hour fire resistance protection. Then you can guess how we're going with the high. The high is 3 hours, and then the moderate has to be protected to 2 hours. Well, it's very, very interesting to see that. That was pretty much all the guidance they gave us, except that they said to use, for the engineers, the structural engineers in particular in the audience, to use the risk category designation that we find in ASCE 7, or really in the California Building Code, because ours is a little bit different than what you have specifically in ASCE 7, the minimum design loads for buildings and other structures. Okay, and so actually I'm chairing that particular committee, and it's been a very interesting time going through and trying to determine the uses, the buildings, the facilities where this would be applicable. Okay, so you can guess when you get into risk category 3 and 4, and that's where this applies, that we have big concerns with various types of projects. Now, the risk categories that are in the California Building Code and ASCE 7 are really intended to have a structural impact more than certainly a wildland fire impact. And so we're taking a view of those uses from a wildfire resiliency as opposed to maybe because of earthquakes or high winds, things of that nature. And so we've been putting together a list. The committee meets every 2 weeks now, and we're getting ready to send certainly up to the WUI task force not only the uses, but the application of the criteria itself in those particular settings. So you can guess that if you're in a very high fire severity zone, you are a fire station, police station, emergency shelter of some sort. Those are very obvious that you're going to be dealing with the increase in fire resistance in the construction of the building. So it's not just the walls, remember, okay? It's doors, it's windows, it's opening protection, it's all kinds of things that get used in the building of buildings. Okay, they need to be used, obviously. So get ready. The WUI task force itself through the State Fire Marshal's office will be going through and evaluating our work as a subcommittee and then determining whether or not they will make the recommendation to the State Fire Marshal's executive staff. And then the executive staff and all that will go through and determine whether or not this moves on. A big aspect of this that certainly our subcommittee is not qualified to really go through, nor do we have the time, are the cost studies that will be imposed as well, because we have to do that for any type of code change amendment. Okay, so get ready. There's just a ton of stuff going on out there. The other thing that's going on is we have the publishing of Part 7, as I mentioned earlier, of Title 24. But we have what's called an intervening cycle. So every 18 months, we actually have the ability to change codes. So the WUI task force is actually taking under consideration any new changes that might need to occur in the WUI code in Part 7 to increase certainly the resilience of the structures that we have. Last thing that I have here for you all really is please stay involved, stay informed, keep a weather eye out for all this. Also, please let people know that this code is basically it's available now and be effective in January. Property owners, other stakeholders, industry members, architects, engineers, builders, they all need to know about this. Okay, please get them the information that they need so that they understand what their role and responsibilities are. Conclusion. This is a critical code for us. Right now, obviously, as I said, it's the same criteria that we're enforcing right at this moment. But as we know, it is essential that we design and build to this particular code to provide at least the chance that is needed for most structures to survive. Okay, implementing the code does increase safety. There's no doubt about it. It also increases, if you will, the economic viability of communities. There are places in California right now that have gone through recent wildland fires that are still suffering from the effects of that. Okay, and then please dig in, understand the code. Feel free to reach out if you want and give me an email or a text or a call or what have you, or frankly, any of the AWC field staff and other types of staff members. We're very involved and we're very, very concerned about this. We want the best for, frankly, our friends and family who live in these areas too. We understand that it has personal impacts. In fact, I have good friends who've lost properties and they're still not yet building or rebuilding in some of these fires here in California. So it's tragic, but we want to do the best we can for the people here in California. With that, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed, or at least didn't suffer through this particular presentation too much. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I'd be more than happy to help with anything related to this or other wood-related types of concerns you might have. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and we will answer any questions you may have.